There are moments in history when entire worlds begin to move slowly at first. Then, with a force that reshapes continents, dreams, and the memories of generations. The story of the Crusader Kingdoms began not on a battlefield, nor in the warm sands of the Levant, but in the quiet hearts of people who lived far away. Across Europe's forests, rivers, and stone-built towns, it began with longing, with fear, with hope, and with the simple human desire to find meaning in a world that often felt fragile and unpredictable. In the late 11th century, Europe was a place of deep contrasts. Dark pine forests rose beside gentle village fields. Monasteries glowed with candlelight while distant trade roads carried the echo of hooves through mist-covered mornings. People lived close to the rhythms of nature, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, praying for safe winters. Life was difficult, but it was familiar. Yet beneath this surface lay a quiet anxiety. Rumors drifted endlessly of rival kingdoms, of wandering knights seeking glory, of lands far beyond the horizon where ancient stories glowed like embers. And then there was Jerusalem. To the Christian peoples of medieval Europe, Jerusalem was not just a city. It was a symbol, a place woven deeply into prayer, imagination, and dreams. It was the spiritual heart of the world, the place where heaven seemed to touch earth. For centuries, pilgrims had traveled there, walking dusty roads, crossing seas, facing dangers with devotion burning in their chests. Some returned home with tales of wonder. Others never returned at all. But the desire to see the holy city never faded. So when word began to spread that Christian pilgrims were being threatened, mistreated, or blocked from the sacred places they longed to visit, unease grew quickly. These stories were often exaggerated, reshaped by repetition and fear, but they ignited emotions already waiting beneath Europe's calm surface. In monasteries, monks murmured prayers for peace. In villages, elders shook their heads at the cruelty of distant rulers. And in courts, where kings and knights gathered beneath painted ceilings, whispers turned into urgent discussions. It was in this atmosphere that Pope Urban II delivered the speech that would shake the world. In the city of Clermont, surrounded by nobles and church officials, he called upon Christians to journey east, not for conquest, he said, but for liberation. He spoke of pilgrims in danger, of holy places in need, and of a spiritual duty that could unite all of Europe's fractured kingdoms. His words carried a fire that traveled beyond the walls of the council. Those who heard him described a moment when the air itself felt electric with purpose. Take the road, he urged them, not for yourself, but for God. The message spread faster than any royal decree. It echoed in stone churches, on narrow village paths, across bustling markets, and through quiet farmland. Knights polished their armor with trembling excitement. Peasants listened with wide eyes. Merchants recalculated their fortunes. Mothers whispered prayers for sons who felt called to leave. And in households across France, Germany, Italy, and beyond, a strange unity formed, thousands of people suddenly preparing to walk toward a land most had never seen. Following a purpose they barely understood, those who joined the First Crusade did so for many reasons. Some were driven by faith, believing they were answering a divine call. Others were guided by adventure, hoping to break free from the monotony of their lives. Some sought wealth or land. Many sought forgiveness, believing that a journey so dangerous and holy could wash away the mistakes of a lifetime. And a few, caught in the current of the moment, simply followed the crowd because it felt like destiny calling their name, don't matter the reason. The roads soon filled with footsteps. Imagine those early days on the march. Long lines of travelers stretching across Europe's rolling fields. The clatter of wagons, the creak of leather saddles, the murmured prayers that rose with the evening smoke. Families trudged forward with sacks on their backs. Knights rode ahead, their armor glinting faintly beneath cloudy skies. Priests walked among them, carrying wooden crosses held high above the crowd. Children tugged at their mothers' cloaks, asking questions about the faraway land they had heard spoken about in church. Travel was slow, painfully slow. Roads turned to mud in the rain. Pathways wound through deep forests where wolves howled at night. Mountains loomed ahead with cold winds that bit at exposed skin. Hunger became a constant companion. There were arguments, panic, stolen goods, lost supplies. Yet through all of it, the march continued. Because once a movement like this begins when faith and fear combine into something larger than individuals, it develops a momentum that no single struggle can stop. Nights on the road carried their own kind of beauty. When fires crackled across makeshift camps, their glow shimmered against metal helmets and soot-stained faces. People huddled under rough blankets, sharing bread, water, and stories. Some spoke of Jerusalem as if they already stood at its gates. Others wondered quietly if they would ever return home. The stars watched them from above, steady and ancient, as if they too were witnessing a moment that would shape centuries. Along the way, more joined the march villagers, merchants, stray knights, even wanderers with no clear origin. The crowd grew, winding through Europe like a river of determination. But with growth came chaos. Supplies dwindled, tempers frayed. Local lords were overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of thousands at their gates. And though leaders tried to maintain order, the sheer size of the movement made discipline nearly impossible. As the Crusaders moved eastward, they encountered lands and peoples entirely new to many of them. They passed through the Byzantine Empire, whose elegant churches and sophisticated cities dazzled the weary travelers. They saw markets filled with spices, silk, and goods they had never imagined. They were greeted with curiosity, suspicion, and sometimes fear. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I, welcomed them cautiously, knowing that an army of tens of thousands was both a powerful ally and a dangerous burden. Negotiations unfolded. Promises were exchanged. And beneath it all, the Crusaders and Byzantines regarded one another with the careful attention of two forces that needed each other, but did not fully trust one another. Soon after, the march grew harsher. The Crusaders crossed into lands where the sun beat down relentlessly, where the soil turned to dust beneath their feet, where fresh water was scarce and precious. The heat shimmered across the horizon, blurring distant shapes and tiring the body in ways Europe's climate never had. People who had dreamed of adventure now struggled simply to keep walking. And then came the first battles. The Crusaders, though exhausted, were fueled by the belief that God had chosen them. Their victories in Anatolia surprised even themselves, giving them renewed strength. The stories of these battles carried ahead of them like gusts of wind announcing a coming storm. But beneath the victories lay something more complicated. The realization that this journey was not only spiritual, but deeply political and intensely human. The Crusaders fought not only for Jerusalem, but for survival. They saw the toll of war etched into the faces of their companions. They felt the sharp divide between their purpose and the realities of the lands they passed through. And they began to understand that what awaited them in the East would demand far more than devotion. But for now, as they marched across unfamiliar landscapes, The dream of Jerusalem remained bright shimmering in the distance like a mirage pulling them forward. And somewhere within this immense tide of travelers was the beginning of something unexpected. The roots of new kingdoms that would one day rise under the burning sun of the Levant. Kingdoms forged not by kings alone, but by ordinary people who had carried their hopes across continents. The Crusader Kingdoms were still only possibilities, faint outlines in the minds of dreamers who did not yet know their own place in history. But the footsteps had begun, and history, once set in motion, rarely stops. The journey east had changed them. By the time the Crusaders first saw the distant contours of the Levant, its low hills, its white stone villages, its pale horizon bending under a different kind of sunlight, they were no longer merely travelers from Europe. They had become something else. Wanderers caught between exhaustion and purpose. Strangers walking into a world that seemed to breathe with an older rhythm. Everything here felt different. The wind carried the scent of warm earth and olive trees. The sky stretched wider, painted with deeper shades of blue. Even the silence held a weight they had never known, as if centuries of stories lingered in the air. The Crusaders had expected danger, but they had not expected such beauty. After months of hardship, the Levant appeared to them like a place touched by both promise and warning. The land itself seemed to whisper a reminder. Those who walk here do not walk without consequence. By the time they reached the outskirts of Antioch, their hopes were mixed with fear, awe, and uncertainty. Antioch was a city no one could ignore, vast, fortified, ancient beyond imagining. Towers rose above the landscape like watchful sentinels. Walls stretched farther than any European fortress, and within those walls lived people whose customs, languages, and beliefs created a world far different from the homes they had left behind to the Crusaders. Antioch was both a challenge and a symbol. Conquering it meant proving their strength. Losing it meant the journey might end before it truly began. And so they surrounded the city with determination heavy enough to outweigh hunger and fatigue. Weeks passed, then months. The siege dragged on, turning hope into something sharp and weary. Supplies dwindled. Food ran low. Some wondered if they had mistaken the path entirely. Yet during those months, something important happened, something that would shape the Crusader states long before Jerusalem ever came into sight. The Crusaders began to learn the land and its people. They traded cautiously with locals, shared campfires with Eastern Christians who spoke different dialects but prayed to the same God, and encountered Muslim villagers who watched them with wary curiosity. For many Crusaders, this was the first time they realized the world was more complicated than the stories they had heard in Europe's quiet churches. They saw farmers tending, fields carved from dry soil with an efficiency born of generations. They smelled the spice markets drifting from distant towns. They heard languages that sounded like music, flowing in rhythms unfamiliar yet strangely peaceful. And in these moments, small seeds of understanding began to take root. Some Crusaders felt admiration. Others felt confusion. All felt humbled. But the siege of Antioch hardened them again. Hunger gnawed at their strength. Disease crept through camps. Tensions rose. And then, against all expectations, Antioch fell. Its walls, once thought unbreakable, now opened to a new chapter of conflict and possibility. The Crusaders had won a victory that felt miraculous, yet they were too tired to celebrate properly. Many simply sat on the ground, staring at the city with hollow eyes. wondering if triumph always came wrapped in such exhaustion. Inside Antioch's walls, the Crusaders found not only shelter, but a glimpse of their future challenges. The city was a mosaic of cultures: Greek, Armenian, Arab, Syrian, Jewish, Latin, all living within one set of walls, but following different rhythms of life. Markets buzzed with goods from across continents. Prayer calls rose and fell throughout the day. Merchants bargained beneath carved arches. Children played in alleyways where sun and shadow danced between stone walls. This was not Europe. And yet, over time, the Crusaders realized they could not rule without understanding the world around them. They adapted slowly, sometimes unwillingly, sometimes with surprising curiosity. They learned new foods, new customs, new routes across desert and hill. They learned that alliances mattered more than swords alone. And they learned that the Levant was not a blank page awaiting their story, but a richly layered land whose people had lived and thrived long before Crusaders ever set foot upon its soil. Antioch eventually became one of the first Crusader states, a principality shaped by both necessity and ambition. But its birth was not simple or peaceful. Disagreements flared among Crusader leaders. Some wanted to push forward to Jerusalem immediately. Others wanted to claim Antioch for themselves. Many disagreed on how land should be divided, who should lead, and what promises should be honored. These conflicts revealed a truth that would shadow the Crusader kingdoms for centuries. Unity was fragile, and ambition often louder than faith. While leaders debated indoors, ordinary Crusaders roamed the streets in awe. They marveled at architecture older than anything in their homelands. They tasted fruits they had never seen before: pomegranates bursting with sweetness, figs warmed by the sun. They discovered shaded courtyards where water trickled softly from fountains. They watched caravans arrive from distant deserts, carrying rugs, incense, and memories of faraway cities. Slowly, the Crusaders realized that if they hoped to survive here, not as visitors but as rulers, they needed more than fortresses. They needed relationships, local allies, trade agreements, understanding. And though some resisted this idea, others embraced it quietly, learning to navigate a world where sword and diplomacy were both essential tools. Meanwhile, the march toward Jerusalem resumed. The journey south carried them through lands shaped by ancient kingdoms and shifting empires. Every hill seemed to hold a story. Every ruin whispered of battles long past. And as the Crusaders traveled, the dream of Jerusalem grew brighter, almost painfully bright. For many, the holy city had become more than a destination. It had become a promise that they replayed in their minds each night, imagining its golden light rising above the horizon. But dreams rarely match reality, and the Crusaders sensed that whatever awaited them would test them far more deeply than anything before. The heat grew sharper, water grew scarce. Some fell behind, unable to continue. Others pressed forward with determination burning stronger than hunger, and finally, after countless struggles, losses, and prayers, they reached Jerusalem. The sight brought tears to hardened warriors, gasps from weary pilgrims, and silent awe from those who had doubted they would ever see it. The city stood on its hill, surrounded by ancient walls that glowed softly beneath the sun, as if carved from time itself. Jerusalem meant fulfillment. It meant purpose. It meant the end of their long journey. But what they did not know was that reaching Jerusalem was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of an entirely new one, A story of fragile kingdoms rising among strangers. A story of coexistence and conflict. A story of hope and hardship intertwined. Because once Jerusalem entered Crusader hands, a question far greater than conquest began to unfold. How do you build a kingdom in a land that was never empty, never waiting, never simple? During those first uncertain weeks, as the Crusaders walked through Jerusalem's streets and listened to the quiet prayers drifting from ancient stones, the first outlines of the Crusader Kingdoms began to take shape, not through formal declarations or grand ceremonies, but through countless small realizations about survival, belonging, and responsibility. The land had welcomed them, but only for a moment. Now, it would test them now. It would shape them now. It would ask them who they truly were. And in those questions lay the birth of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the fragile heart of the Crusader world. The morning light in the Holy Land was unlike anything the Crusaders had ever known. In Europe, the dawn arrived. Softly mists rising from fields, dew clinging to grass, birds fluttering into grey-blue skies. But here, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, sunrise felt like the world opening its eyes all at once. The light spilled over the hills in gold and white, sharp enough to make even seasoned warriors squint. The air warmed within minutes, and the shadows of palm trees stretched long and thin across the dusty ground. It was a land where the sun ruled everything from the rhythm of work to the boundaries of comfort. For the Crusaders who stayed behind to build a new kingdom, this land felt both wondrous and unforgiving. Many had expected triumph and rest after reaching Jerusalem, believing their hardships were finally behind them. Instead, they found themselves at the beginning of an entirely new struggle, learning how to live, survive, and govern in a place that did not bend easily to foreign habits. Jerusalem was theirs, but so were its expectations, its complexities, and its countless challenges in the early months of settlement. The Crusaders were overwhelmed by daily realities far removed from the glory-filled stories they had imagined. The heat drained their strength, forcing them to work in shorter bursts. The terrain rocky, uneven, carved by centuries of shifting empires, made farming difficult. Wells ran dry without warning. Food supplies fluctuated. Even the horses, brought all the way from Europe, struggled under the relentless sun. What had felt like a divine victory now demanded practical wisdom, patience, and adaptation. To their surprise, the Crusaders quickly discovered that life in the Levant required cooperation. They needed the expertise of those who had lived here long before their arrival: Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, Jews, and local Muslims who understood the climate, the soil, and the fragile balance that allowed people to thrive in this ancient land. Some locals welcomed the Crusaders cautiously, hoping stability would bring prosperity. Others observed from a distance, uncertain whether these newcomers would become protectors or oppressors, and some resisted quietly, waiting to see how long the foreign kingdom could last. Despite this, interactions grew slowly but steadily. Crusader knights learned which crops flourished under the hot sun and which could survive the scarce rainfall. They learned to build cisterns and irrigation channels. They tasted spices that seemed to awaken parts of the palate they never knew existed. Cinnamon, saffron, cumin, cardamom. They walked through bustling markets where merchants shouted prices in a mixture of languages. And they marveled at fabrics dyed in colors deeper than anything sold in Europe. And with each passing day, they realized something profound. Though they had conquered Jerusalem, they were the ones being reshaped. Life in the Crusader Kingdoms did not revolve solely around war and politics. It unfolded in quieter, more human ways. Children of Crusader settlers played in the streets with local children, learning fragments of each other's languages. Farmers tended shared fields. Artisans exchanged skills, European blacksmiths learning new forging techniques. Local stonemasons teaching Crusaders how to carve arches that matched the land's ancient style. Relationships formed, friendships blossomed, and a surprising cultural blend began to weave itself through the kingdom's daily life. Still, the Crusader states were built on a foundation that constantly trembled. Their population was small compared to the vast world surrounding them. Their leaders faced the pressure of maintaining defense, diplomacy, and spiritual purpose all at once. Every decision carried weight, every misstep could lead to conflict, and every moment of peace felt potentially temporary. Jerusalem, newly crowned as the heart of the kingdom, was both a sacred treasure and a target. Its streets filled with pilgrims, priests, merchants, and warriors buzzed with life at every hour. Pilgrims from Europe arrived with wide eyes, marveling at the city's holy sites. Monks guided them through churches, chapels, and ancient steps polished smooth by centuries of footfalls. Markets spilled into alleyways with the scent of fresh bread, roasted meat, and warm spices drifting through the air. Laughter mingled with prayer, chants, and through it all, the sun burned gently across the city's golden stones. Crusader nobles set up courts in restored palaces. Knights patrolled the streets, their armor gleaming faintly in the heat. Diplomats negotiated with surrounding Muslim rulers, sometimes with tension, sometimes with surprising respect. For despite the wars that had brought the Crusaders here, life in the Levant did not divide neatly into enemies and allies. There were truces, trade agreements, and quiet periods when coexistence seemed not only possible, but natural. Ordinary Crusaders tried to adapt in ways they had never imagined. They traded wool cloaks for lighter robes. They wore sandals during the hottest hours. They wrapped their heads in cloth to protect themselves from the relentless sun. Their meals shifted from heavy European stews to dishes of dates, olives, lamb cooked with herbs, and bread baked in earthen ovens. Their sense of time changed. 2 days began earlier, rested at noon, revived in the evening when the desert cooled and breezes carried relief through the streets, and at night, the sky shimmered with stars, brighter than anything seen back home. The constellations felt closer, clearer, as if the heavens themselves leaned gently over the land. Many Crusaders found comfort in those quiet hours sitting on rooftops or leaning against stone walls, listening to the distant music drifting through the city. Sometimes it was a Muslim call to prayer rising gracefully into the night. Sometimes it was the soft hymn of a Christian choir, and sometimes it was simply the wind brushing against old stones, reminding everyone that life in this land was older than any kingdom they could build. But beneath these moments of peace, something deeper stirred. The Crusaders sensed that their presence in the Holy Land was precarious. They were surrounded by powerful forces, Muslim rulers in Damascus, Aleppo, and Egypt, who watched the new kingdom closely. Even when truces held, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Stories spread of armies gathering, alliances shifting, and leaders preparing for inevitable confrontation. Yet the Crusaders also believed fiercely in their purpose. They saw themselves as guardians of the Christian holy sites, protectors of pilgrims, and stewards of a land they believed God had entrusted to them. This belief strengthened their resolve, giving meaning to their struggles and shaping the kingdom's identity. And so life continued fragile, hopeful, uncertain. Crusader knights trained under scorching daylight, their armor heating under the sun until it burned their skin. Farmers who had once worked in the cool soils of Europe now tilled fields under the shadow of desert hills. Traders bargained in multiple languages, waving their hands dramatically as they gestured toward goods. Monks copied manuscripts in quiet chambers where sunlight filtered through narrow windows. Women tended homes that blended European manners with Levantine-designed stone courtyards. Shaded alcoves, cool water jars kept ready for visitors. Everywhere, cultures intertwined in subtle ways. A Crusader household might serve meals on dishes crafted by local potters. Children might wear clothes woven in Damascus alongside crosses sent from France. Songs learned in European villages might echo through streets where the scent of incense filled the air. In these peaceful layers of daily life, a kingdom slowly emerged, purely European, not purely Levantine, but something entirely new, a crossroads kingdom, a fragile experiment built by strangers learning to live under a burning sun. The Crusader Kingdoms would one day face storms far greater than they could imagine. But for now, in this early chapter, they were simply trying to belong, holding tight to faith, adapting to a foreign land, and shaping their identity, one scorching day and cool starlit night at a time. Because building a kingdom is not only about walls and wars, it is about understanding, endurance, and the quiet courage to begin again in a world that feels both familiar and entirely new. The Crusader Kingdoms, still young and trembling under the weight of their own uncertainty, soon learned a truth that every empire must eventually face. Survival is built not only on courage, but on stone. The land they had conquered was beautiful, ancient, and full of life, but it was also vulnerable. Open plains stretched toward distant horizons. Winding valleys provided quiet passage for armies. Desert winds whispered warnings that borders here shifted like sand dunes, shaped by politics, alliances, and rivalries older than anything the Crusaders had known. And so they began to build. The first Crusader castles rose quickly, simple wooden fortifications perched on hills, forming rough silhouettes against the burning sky. But these early walls were only the beginning. As the Crusaders came to understand the land more deeply, their architecture evolved. They learned to read the landscape, the curves of the hills, the flow of the rivers, the routes of the caravans that had traveled here for centuries. They learned where the wind carried dust storms, where the ground crumbled easily, and where the earth beneath them was strong enough to support stone walls that would rise like giants. Soon, Jerusalem and its neighboring regions were crowned with fortresses unlike anything Europe had ever seen. These were not crude outposts. They were masterpieces, great stone guardians built to hold an empire together. Their towers watched the horizon. Their walls embraced garrisons, chapels, granaries, and water cisterns. Their gates opened to pilgrims seeking refuge and closed swiftly when danger drew near. To understand the Crusader Kingdoms is to understand these castles, for they became the beating heart of the new world the Crusaders were struggling to build. One of the earliest was the Tower of David in Jerusalem itself, restored and strengthened so it could serve as both a symbol of authority and a shield for the holy city. Its massive stones seemed to glow during sunset, reflecting shades of orange and gold. Knights patrolled its ramparts, their silhouettes merging with the warm evening light as they looked over a city filled with life, monks chanting in dim churches, merchants closing their stalls for the night, travelers resting after long journeys. Outside Jerusalem, The landscape soon glittered with fortifications. In the Judean hills, castles rose atop rocky cliffs, overlooking valleys where shepherds guided flocks beneath wide skies. In the coastal plains, where the salty wind from the Mediterranean carried stories from faraway lands, the Crusaders built strongholds that served as both trading hubs and protective barriers. Among these fortresses stood places like Jaffa, Acre, Caesarea, and Ascalon, cities that blended European ambition with ancient local architecture. Their harbors filled with ships from Italy, France, England, and beyond, bringing goods, pilgrims, envoys, and messages from home. These ports were not only lifelines, but symbols of how deeply the Crusader Kingdoms depended on connection with the wider world. But the true jewels of Crusader architecture were their great inland castles, fortresses that stood like stone miracles against the desert sky. Cracked chevaliers, perched high in Syria, would one day become the most famous. Though expanded later by the Knights Hospitaller, even its early Crusader form was breathtaking. Thick walls curved into smooth arcs. Towers rose like watchful guardians. Chambers, tunnels, and halls lay hidden within its depths, cool against the relentless heat. From its heights, one could see vast stretches of land-rolling hills, winding roads, distant villages, each one connected to the castle's purpose of vigilance and protection. Inside Crack, life followed a rhythm shaped by discipline and devotion. Knights trained in the courtyard, their swords flashing silver in the sun. Horses stamped their hooves in the stables. Monks whispered prayers in small chapels where candles burned steadily in thick air. Cooks prepared meals of bread, olives, cheese, and roasted lamb. And at night, when torches flickered along the walls, the sound of soft conversation drifted through the corridors like a low, warm river. These castles were more than military outposts. They were homes, sanctuaries, symbols of an empire struggling to root itself in a land far from where its people were born. To the Crusaders, stone became a kind of languagey way of saying, "We are here. We will stand firm. We will learn to belong." Each castle told its own story. Some were built atop the ruins of older fortresses, their foundations shaped by civilizations long gone. Others rose in places where no stones had stood before, carving new chapters into the landscape. Walls were thick not only to withstand siege engines, but to store grain, keep water cool, and shelter families during times of uncertainty. Every tower held memories of long nights watching for distant fire signals of approaching armies. Warnings carried by torchht. And yet, despite their strength, the castles did not isolate the Crusaders. They connected them. Roads stretched between fortresses like threads of communication routes for soldiers, merchants, diplomats, and pilgrims. Travelers rested within these stone havens, sharing stories of battles, treaties, and rumors from distant courts. Knights from France might share meals with Armenian scouts. Merchants from Venice might sleep beside Syrian traders. In the cool stone halls of these castles, cultures intertwined in ways that would have once seemed impossible. Life inside the Crusader fortresses revealed a deeper truth. Even in war, human routines endure. Horses needed grooming. Bread needed baking. Weapons needed repairing. Children played in courtyards, running between the knees of armored knights. Women tended gardens where herbs grew in small pockets of shade. Priests tended to the wounded, offering comfort in low-voiced prayers. And at night, when the world cooled and stars shimmered above, People sat together in quiet companionships, sharing stories not of conquest, but of home, fears, hopes, and the fragile beauty of ordinary days. Still, the castles were reminders of constant danger. The Crusader Kingdoms were surrounded by powerful Muslim states: Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, Egypt, each with leaders watching closely, each considering when and how to challenge this foreign presence. The Crusaders understood this well. Their stones were not carved for comfort alone. They were carved for survival. And yet, within their walls, something extraordinary happened. A sense of identity took shape. The Crusaders were no longer simply Europeans living abroad. They were Franks of the East, latent Christians forging a new existence between cultures. Their architecture reflected this transformation. Their language slowly changed, colors blending. Their daily habits shifted. Even their clothing began to resemble a blend of European form and Levantine practicality. The castles, in their silent dignity, held these stories of adaptation, resilience, connection, and longing. As the years passed, travelers from Europe would stand in awe before these towering fortresses, marveling at how the Crusaders had built such wonders in so distant and unfamiliar a land. And locals, too, watched the fortresses rise with mixed feelings: fear, admiration, frustration, and curiosity woven into a single thread of emotion. But the greatest irony was this: for all their strength, for all their beauty, the castles were not eternal. One day, many would fall, but their stones, their ruins, and their memories would remain, whispering stories of a time when people from two worlds tried to shape a fragile kingdom together. For now, though, the walls stood tall, shimmering under the burning sun, glowing at dusk and casting long shadows over a kingdom still learning how to dream. For a time, the Crusader Kingdoms existed in a delicate silence, a space between storms, a thin breath of calm suspended across the hot winds of the Levant. In Europe, storytellers painted the Crusaders as knights locked in endless battle, steel clashing against steel beneath a sunlit sky. But the truth of life in the Holy Land was far more intricate, shaped not only by war, but by long stretches of uneasy peace, quiet negotiations, fragile alliances, and the soft human moments that unfolded when swords were finally lowered after the First Crusade. The rulers of Jerusalem found themselves surrounded by a world that was complex, ancient, and constantly shifting. The Muslim realms around them were not united. They were divided by politics, geography, and old rivalries. In Damascus, one ruler watched the Crusaders with suspicion. In Aleppo, another wondered whether alliances with the newcomers might serve his own interests. In Egypt, the Fatimids planned their next moves carefully, balancing caution with ambition. The Crusaders knew they were outsiders in a land of seasoned powers, and survival meant understanding the political language of the region just as much as wielding the sword. And so, surprisingly to some, diplomacy began to weave itself through the Crusader Kingdoms like a quiet thread running beneath louder tales of war. Envoys traveled on dusty roads between castles and courts, their small groups accompanied by guards who rode beneath the heavy heat. They carried letters wrapped in wax seals, gifts meant to open doors, and requests shaped with careful respect. Some Crusader lords negotiated trade agreements with Muslim neighboring states: grain for timber, salt for silver, horses for weapons. Others sought truces that lasted months or even years, allowing farmers to plant safely and merchants to travel without fear in Jerusalem's shaded halls. Ambassadors in flowing robes spoke with Crusader nobles dressed in linen tunics. their conversations unfolding slowly over cups of spiced wine. The two sides did not always trust each other, but often they understood one another better than the legends claim. Both knew the weight of ruling. Both knew the fragility of peace. Both understood that war was costly, draining not only blood, but the spirit of the land itself. And beneath these political interactions lay something even more unexpected. Moments of genuine connection. A Muslim astronomer might share knowledge with a Christian scholar, pointing out constellations that guided travelers since ancient times. A Crusader healer might learn new remedies from a local physician, herbs that grew only in the valleys of the Levant, poultices that soothed fevers, techniques carried from Persia or India. Traders from Damascus wandered through Crusader markets, comparing goods with merchants from Venice. Children playing in mixed villages sometimes learned bits of each other's languages without even realizing it. Life in the Crusader Kingdoms was not defined solely by conflict. It was shaped by a daily balancing act, built on adaptation, compromise, and the simple, shared desire to live. Yet peace never remained still for long. Across the desert sands, forces gathered like clouds before a distant storm. Ambitious rulers rose and fell. Armies marched in and out of alliances. And whenever tensions edged too high, the Crusader kingdoms felt the tremor before the impact. Small border raids flared suddenly, disappearing as quickly as they arrived. Caravan routes were disrupted. Rumors spread of armies gathering behind city walls. These whispers drifted through marketplaces, along harbor docks, and through castle corridors where knights tightened their grip on their swords. Still, the Crusaders understood that fear alone could not sustain a kingdom. So they worked diligently to build communities that felt familiar, comforting, and hopeful. Villages grew around the bases of castles. Fields were planted in neat rows, their green shoots emerging from dry soil like stubborn promises. Monasteries flourished, their bells echoing softly across sunlit hills. Pilgrims continued arriving, tracing the footsteps of biblical stories in reverent silence. Artisans crafted pottery, metalwork, and wood carvings that blended European motifs with Levantine elegance. Life moved slowly, gently, even beautifully, proving that even in a land shaped by warfare, ordinary days could still bloom. The Crusader kingdoms also developed their own identity during these years. They became neither fully European nor entirely Levantine. Instead, they stood as a crossroads. Languages met, where cultures braided together, where traditions mingled into something new. Knights who settled permanently began to understand the rhythm of the land, the high heat of midday, the soft winds of evening, the rare but precious rains that swept across the valleys. Some Crusaders married local women and raised children who grew up speaking multiple languages, wearing clothes suited to both climate and custom, and living comfortably in a world shaped by two heritages. These families formed a vital thread in the fabric of the kingdom, bridging divides that politics could not easily cross. And yet, even as peaceful rhythms settled into the kingdom, the Crusader leaders knew that this calm was temporary. They watched the horizon with careful eyes, aware that the surrounding Muslim states would someday unite under a leader strong enough to challenge them. The question was not if that day would come, but when. For now, though, the Crusaders lived in the quiet between storms. Imagine an evening in this fragile peace. A soft breeze drifting across the hills, carrying the scent of olive trees. Farmers returning home with baskets of grapes or figs. Knights sitting in courtyards, removing their helmets and letting the cool air touch their tired faces. A priest lighting candles in a small stone chapel, the flames dancing gently. Nearby, a Muslim merchant prepares tea in his home, listening to the distant hum of a Crusader market. Somewhere, a child laughs beneath a golden sky. Somewhere else, a woman hums an old song from her homeland, blending with the music of another culture in ways she never expected. This was the forgotten truth of the Crusader Kingdoms. They were not endless war, they were endless effort, a constant attempt to balance survival with coexistence, tradition with change, fear with hope. For years, this delicate balance held shape by treaties, kindness, trade, and the stubborn will of people determined to live despite uncertainty. But as history often teaches, peace is a traveler who cannot stay forever. Far to the east, in Damascus, new winds were beginning to stir. Leaders were changing. Ambitions were growing, and slowly, steadily, the foundations of a new force were being laid, one that would rise like a gathering storm and challenge the Crusader world in ways they could not yet imagine. But for now, in these years of calm, the Crusader kingdoms learned how to breathe, how to grow, and how to exist in a land both welcoming and wary. Because sometimes, the quiet between wars is where the heart of history truly lives. In the warm evenings of the Levant, when the sun slipped behind the hills and the sky turned the color of rose petals dipped in gold, a quietness settled across the Crusader kingdoms. It was the kind of quiet that felt peaceful on the surface, markets closing, bells ringing softly, families gathering around simple meals, but beneath it, something deeper stirred. Something subtle, something coming from the east, like a breath carried on the wind from distant cities that watched and waited. Those whispers came from Damascus. For years, the Muslim lands surrounding the Crusader kingdoms had been divided. Rival rulers competed for influence. Alliances shifted like desert dunes. Fortresses changed hands in the span of a month. The Crusaders benefited from these divisions, surviving not through overwhelming strength, but through the fortunate disunity of their neighbors. But history, like life, never remains still. Change begins quietly, gathering strength long before anyone notices, and into that shifting world stepped a man who did not look like a conqueror at first glance, Salah ad-Din. Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom the Crusaders would one day call. Saladin arrived not with thunder, but with calm purpose. Born in Tikrit, far from the walls of Jerusalem, he grew up in a world shaped by study, faith, and military responsibility. He was not raised on dreams of conquest. His early years were filled with books, not battle cries. He preferred learning to killing, reading to riding, contemplation to conflict. Few would have predicted that this quiet young man would rise to become the most renowned Muslim leader of his age. Yet destiny sometimes chooses unexpected hands. When Saladin entered the service of Nur-ad-Din, the powerful ruler of Syria, he did so with humility. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he acted. And slowly, the world began to shift around him. His loyalty impressed his leaders. His kindness impressed his soldiers. His intelligence impressed everyone. Damascus, a city of gardens, palaces, and ancient mosques, began to notice the young man whose presence seemed to hold the potential of something yet unseen. While the Crusaders continued their rhythms of daily life, farming, building, praying, rumors drifted across their borders like dust carried by the wind. Rumors of new alliances forming, of armies training with purpose, of leaders uniting under shared visions rather than competing ambitions. At first, these whispers felt distant. The Crusader Kingdoms had heard such stories before. They had faced raiding parties, sudden uprisings, and competitive lords who sought glory through local conflicts. But this time, something was different. The Muslim world was beginning to look not outward, but inward toward unity. Saladin was not yet the central figure of this movement, but he was part of its heartbeat. He learned discipline. He learned strategy. He learned the delicate balance between mercy and strength. And perhaps most importantly, he learned patience, the kind that allows a leader to wait for the right moment to guide the world into its next chapter. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem and the surrounding Crusader states, daily life carried on under the bright, uncompromising sun. The Franks lived as though the fragile peace would last forever. Knights patrolled castle walls, their armor warming under the midday heat. Pilgrims moved through the city streets in steady streams, their footsteps echoing near ancient stones. Merchants argued over prices with the same passion they had shown for decades. Farmers tended terraced fields, coaxing life from the dry soil. Children played in courtyard shadows, unaware that their world balanced on a thin line between calm and conflict. But beneath the surface, tensions grew quietly, like cracks forming in a stone long before it breaks. The Crusader rulers faced challenges of their own. Leadership disputes stirred unrest. Some nobles quarreled over land and titles. Others argued over alliances, whether to trust Byzantium, whether to negotiate with neighboring Muslim states, whether to launch new campaigns or strengthen their defenses. Decisions were made with hesitation, sometimes shaped more by pride than by wisdom. And while the Crusaders debated, Saladin matured. His reputation grew not through brutality, but through dignity. He was known for keeping his word, for acting with restraint, for protecting civilians during conflicts. Even his rivals respected him. In Cairo, where he eventually served under the Fatimid Caliphate, he demonstrated both administrative skill and military discipline, strengthening his power quietly, carefully, without the arrogance that often accompanies ambition. The Crusaders noticed the rise of a new figure in the East, but they did not yet understand what it meant. They saw skirmishes, shifting treaties, and political reshuffling as normal patterns in a land filled with constant change. They underestimated the quiet man whose mind was shaped not by ego but by purpose. And so, the storm gathered slowly. Imagine a warm evening in the kingdom of Jerusalem, a knight leaning against a tower wall, gazing east at the dim glow of distant cities. He does not know that in those glowing cities, leaders are speaking of unity, of reclaiming lost lands, of restoring control over the holy city. He has heard the name Saladin, but it means nothing to him yet. He thinks of tomorrow's patrol, of the merchants arriving from Jaffa, of the pilgrims expected from Europe. He sees the horizon as peaceful, but beyond that horizon, in Damascus and Cairo, strategies are being whispered, plans drawn not from hatred, but from the desire to reunite a fractured world. Saladin, still not yet the towering figure history will remember, walks through palace gardens in quiet thought. He listens to the sound of fountains. He studies writings from philosophers and scholars. He prays beneath the arches of mosques lit with soft lamplight, and somewhere in those quiet nights, he feels the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders. He does not rush toward it. He does not grasp at it. He simply prepares. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Leaders debate in stone halls that echo with tension. Some sense the change coming. Others cling to old habits. All feel the pressure of ruling a kingdom surrounded by uncertainty. And slowly, across the desert, the winds shift. First softly, then steadily, then with a subtle strength that hints at storms yet to be born. Because the Crusader Kingdoms, for all their walls and alliances, existed within a world larger than themselves. And that world was beginning to awaken under the guidance of a man who believed deeply not in destruction, but in unity. The gathering storm was not loud, it was not violent, it was simply inevitable. And in the quiet before the tempest, the Crusaders still lived their ordinary lives beneath a sky that had no intention of staying calm for much longer. For many years, the Crusader Kingdoms had lived suspended between sunlight and shadow, hope on one side, danger on the other. But nothing prepared them for the moment when the horizon finally darkened, when the quiet whispers coming from the east grew into a wind strong enough to shake the foundations of their fragile world. And at the center of this awakening stood Saladin, no longer the quiet young administrator of Damascus or Cairo, but a leader whose presence stirred armies, inspired loyalty, and carried the weight of a united vision. By the 1180s, Saladin had accomplished what few believed possible. He brought together the divided Muslim lands, weaving them into a shared purpose through patience, diplomacy, and unwavering conviction. Syria, Egypt, and parts of Mesopotamia no longer argued among themselves. They looked outward, toward the Crusader kingdoms that had held Jerusalem for close to a century. And the Crusaders, once strong but now fractured by rivalries and political tension, were not prepared for what was coming. Life in Jerusalem continued quietly in those early years before the storm. The streets bustled with traders calling out prices for figs, olives, and embroidered fabrics. Children ran through narrow alleyways, chasing one another beneath arches worn by countless footsteps. Monks carried water from cisterns to cool the stone floors of churches. Knights patrolled the city walls under the relentless sun, their armor shimmering faintly with heat. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands, their eyes filling with awe as they gazed upon the Holy Sepulchre. But beneath this familiar rhythm, tension pulsed like a slow, growing heartbeat. Political disputes weakened the Crusader leadership. King Baldwin IV, the young monarch who fought his battles while suffering from leprosy, ruled with bravery that defied his illness, but even his courage could not unite the quarreling nobles. When he died, the kingdom fell into the hands of leaders whose ambitions clashed more than their strategies aligned. Misjudgments multiplied. Trust diminished. Neighboring Muslim rulers watched carefully, and Saladin acted with patience. Yet even with rising tensions, the Crusaders did not fully understand the magnitude of the storm gathering against them. They had grown accustomed to the idea that their world, despite its troubles, would hold. They believed the walls of Jerusalem would remain strong. They believed reinforcements from Europe would arrive if needed. They believed the sun that rose over the golden city each morning would continue to rise over a kingdom that still belonged to them. Then came Hattin. It was in the summer of 1187 when the Crusader armies marched into the dry hills near the Horns of Hattin, believing they could confront Saladin and break the growing threat. But the heat was merciless, the water sources scarce, and Saladin's strategy precise. His forces surrounded the Crusaders, cutting them off from relief. Smoke, fire, dust, and exhaustion combined into a nightmare that no knight had ever imagined while traveling from the cool fields of Europe. By the end of the battle, the Crusader army lay broken. King Guy was captured. The true crosser relic carried into battle with reverence was seized. And across the Crusader states, shock spread like a tremor. The defeat at Hatton was not merely a lost battle. It was the unraveling of a kingdom. One castle after another surrendered. Orfela Saladin's forces moved swiftly through the land: Tiberias, Acre, Nablus, Sidon, Beirut. Some opened their gates in hope of mercy. Others resisted briefly before realizing resistance was futile. Saladin treated many civilians with respect, offering protection instead of punishment, and word of his actions carried across hills and valleys, softening fear even as anxiety grew. And then all routes pointed to the inevitable: Jerusalem, the holy city, once defended by confident armies, now stood with only a fraction of its former strength. Balian of Ibelin, a nobleman known for diplomacy more than warfare, took charge of its defense. He walked through its streets, speaking gently to frightened families, to mothers clutching their children, to merchants closing their stalls as uncertainty filled the air. Priests prayed with trembling voices in churches lit by flickering candles. Knights who remained polished their swords under torchlight, preparing for a battle they knew they could not win. Jerusalem held its breath outside the city. Saladin's forces approached with quiet determination. Their banners fluttered softly in the warm wind. Campfires dotted the hillsides like stars fallen to earth. Soldiers murmured prayers beneath the night sky. And somewhere in that vast sea of humanity, Saladin himself stood in contemplation, aware of the immense weight of what he was about to reclaim. When the siege began, Jerusalem trembled. Stones cracked under the force of catapults. Arrows whistled across walls warmed by the afternoon sun. Smoke rose slowly from the outskirts. Yet within the city, a different kind of silence spread, one filled not with panic, but with sorrow. People gathered in churches, leaning together in shared grief. Some whispered prayers for deliverance. Others simply held hands, seeking comfort in the presence of those around them. After days of struggle, Balian realized that resistance would only bring suffering, and so he negotiated surrender with dignity and courage, ensuring that Jerusalem would not fall in flames or bloodshed. When Saladin entered the city, something remarkable happened. There was no mass slaughter, no revenge taken, no cruelty unleashed. He ordered that civilians be protected. Families were allowed to leave safely. Some were even freed without ransom. Saladin walked through the streets with calm purpose, restoring order where chaos might have taken hold. In a place where cycles of revenge could have reignited, he chose mercy. The Crusaders who remained watched from rooftops and windows as the city changed hands, their hearts filled with quiet grief. Many had lived here for years. Some had been born here. Others still believed they would one day return. But now, Jerusalem belonged once again to the Muslim world. At dusk, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the city glowed briefly in a fading halo of light, the full weight of the moment settled in Jerusalem had fallen. The news raced across continents, echoing through European courts, monasteries, markets, and tiny village churches. People wept in disbelief. Kings and nobles argued over how to respond, and poets wrote verses about the tragedy carried on parchment by travelers who crossed seas with heavy hearts. But in the Holy Land itself, the twilight felt strangely quiet. A knight stood on a balcony, gazing toward the horizon where the last rays of sunlight touched the dome of the rock. He felt the ache of loss heavy in his chest. Yet he also felt something unexpected, a calm acceptance. A sorrow that softened rather than sharpened. History, he realized, does not ask whether we are ready. It simply moves. In the streets below, local families returned to their routines, adjusting to new rulers. Traders reopened shops. Smoke drifted gently from cook fires. Life continued with its usual endurance. And in that moment, between day and night, Jerusalem stood timeless, once again a city that outlived kings, conquerors, crusaders, and storms. A city that held memories like the stones in its walls, firm, unbroken, eternal. The fall of Jerusalem was not the end of the Crusader Kingdoms, but it was the moment they understood their vulnerability. It was the sound of a fragile world cracking softly under the weight of destiny. And it was the beginning of a long, difficult struggle to reclaim what had been lost. But for now, in the hush of that twilight, the world simply listened, because some moments do not shout their significance, they whisper it. A medieval castle was more than stone and strategy. It was a stage where power unfolded. A world of velvet whispers, glittering feasts, quiet alliances, and decisions that shaped the fate of entire kingdoms. Behind the thick walls and guarded gates lived not only soldiers and servants, but also kings, queens, princes, princesses, noble families, and their courts. Their lives created a second universe inside the castle, one filled with ceremony, etiquette, rivalry, ambition, and moments of breathtaking beauty. To walk through such a castle was to witness the pulse of medieval authority, wrapped in layers of tradition and human longing. Imagine entering the great hall on the evening of a royal gathering. Torches glow along the stone walls, their flames casting soft waves of gold across the tapestries. Musicians play gentle melodies from the gallery above, harps, flutes, viols blending into a warm embrace of sound. Servants move silently between long tables, carrying pitchers of spiced wine, loaves of fresh bread, platters of roasted meat, dishes made from herbs gathered in the castle gardens. The scent of honey and wood smoke lingers in the air. At the far end of the hall, beneath a canopy embroidered with royal symbols, sits the noble family. A king, wrapped in a cloak trimmed with fur, listens carefully to a visiting diplomat. His expression is calm, thoughtful, trained over years to reveal little. Beside him, the queen sits with gentle poise, her hands folded gracefully, her eyes observing the hall with quiet intelligence. Their presence alone gives the room a sense of order, center of gravity that everyone else carefully orbits. Yet royal life inside a castle was neither simple nor endlessly grand. Beneath the polished surface lay constant negotiation. Lords offered loyalty but expected land or favor in return. Knights sought recognition for their service. Merchants presented gifts, hoping for trade privileges. Diplomats arrived carrying messages rolled into parchment, sealed with wax, each one capable of altering alliances or sparking wars. Every smile, every word spoken in the royal court carried weight. But amidst the politics, there was also beauty. Queens often took great interest in the cultural life of the castle. They decorated chambers with fine tapestries depicting scenes from mythology or scripture. They oversaw musicians, poets, and artists who traveled from far regions to entertain and seek patronage. Their chambers smelled of lavender and rosewater, warmed by small fires that softened the chill of stone. In the quiet moments of morning, the queen might sit by a window, sunlight spilling across her embroidery frame, stitching images of hunts, gardens, or religious scenes into fabric that would outlast lifetimes. Princes and princesses grew up between two worlds, one of privilege and one of expectation. Tutors taught them languages, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and diplomacy. Knights trained them in riding and self-defense. Priests guided them in faith. From early childhood they were taught that every decision they made might one day affect thousands. Their playtime in the gardens or courtyards was balanced with lessons in restraint, leadership, and courtesy. Even their friendships carried political significance. Yet despite this weight, there were tender moments. A young prince might race with his friends along the inner walls, laughter echoing between towers. A princess might feed crumbs to birds in the courtyard fountain, her hair catching the evening sunlight. During feasts, royal children sometimes hid behind pillars or climbed onto benches to watch jugglers and musicians. For all the expectations placed on them, they were still children, discovering the small joys of life inside stone walls. In the upper chambers of the castle, the royal council assembled regularly. Here, kings and trusted advisors discussed taxes, borders, disputes between nobles, rebellions, alliances, or threats of war. Maps spread across wooden tables. Wax seals were broken. Scribes recorded decisions by candlelight. The fate of entire regions often depended on conversations held in these private rooms, where the world outside narrowed into a few decisive voices. Courtiers played a significant role in castle life. They were nobles of varying ranks who lived within the castle or visited frequently, hoping for influence or favor. Their presence created a lively environment filled with conversation, elegance, and subtle competition. Courtiers practiced refined manners, dressed in fine garments, dyed with costly pigments, and moved through the castle with an air of confidence. Some brought humor and entertainment. Others brought ambition sharp enough to cut. All were part of the delicate ecosystem that breathed around the throne. Feasts were the grandest moments in royal castles. They celebrated coronations, victories, marriages, births, and religious festivals. During these nights, the castle transformed into a world of glittering light. Tables sagged under the weight of dishes, game birds roasted with herbs, pies filled with spiced fruit, bowls of nuts and berries, wheels of cheese, honey cakes, and goblets rimmed with silver. Minstrels told stories of ancient heroes. Dancers spun in embroidered gowns. Acrobats flipped through the air to the sound of delighted gasps. And at the center of it all, the royal family watched with pride and dignity, their presence adding a sense of magic to the night. But life in royal courts was not always joyful. Rivalries simmered beneath smiles. Ambitions clashed behind polite greetings. Rumors drifted through corridors like invisible guests. A whispered sentence could shift the balance of power. A single misstep during a negotiation could change the course of history. And outside the castle walls, common people prayed that their rulers would make wise decisions, for their lives were shaped by choices made far above them. Even within the castle, the king or queen was not isolated from hardship. Illnesses struck without mercy. Difficult winters strained supplies. Conflicts with neighboring kingdoms weighed heavily on their shoulders. Moments of private sorrow unfolded behind closed doors. Loss, fear, regret, or the heavy loneliness that sometimes comes with leadership. But the castle continued to function, its routine steady and unbreaking, offering support even in times of personal struggle. There were also moments of profound symbolism in royal castles. Coronations transformed great halls into sacred spaces where power passed from one generation to the next. Weddings filled the courtyard with flowers, music, and hope for peaceful alliances. When a new heir was born, bells rang from the towers, echoing across fields and villages, announcing a future that would one day unfold within those very walls. And in quiet nights, when storms rolled across the sky, kings and queens often found themselves awake near the window, listening to the rain striking stone, thinking of the many lives depending on their guidance. The castle around them felt immense and eternal, yet the weight of their role made them feel achingly human. They knew that one day their names would fade into history, but the stone walls would remain witnesses to all they had built, all they had endured. Life in the royal court was thus a world of balance, strength and vulnerability, power and responsibility, ceremony and humanity. The castle served as both shield and symbol, protecting royalty while reminding them that their duty extended beyond its gates. Even today, when visitors wander through the remains of royal apartments, chambers softened by sunlight, halls shaped by centuries of footsteps, they can sense the echoes of kings and queens who once stood where they now stand. The faint rustle of a silk gown, the murmur of a quiet promise, the distant echo of a crown being placed on a bowed head. For the story of medieval royalty is not only a story of rule and decision, it is a story of people living within the embrace of stone, trying to lead, to protect, to dream, and to find meaning in a world where every choice left a mark on history. Sleep now. The next chapter of history awaits. As the years passed after the Third Crusade, the Crusader Kingdoms found themselves living in a world that felt both familiar and increasingly fragile. The coastline still sparkled in the morning sun. Ships still arrived from distant kingdoms, and markets still bustled with merchants calling out their goods. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, the Crusaders could sense a subtle shift in undertow, pulling gently but steadily, reminding them that the world around them was changing. With Jerusalem gone, the heart of the Crusader world had moved to the coast. Cities like Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli grew into vibrant centers of trade and diplomacy. Their harbors became lifelines, welcoming ships filled with pilgrims, soldiers, spices, silk, and stories from Europe. Their walls, strong and imposing, stood like sentinels guarding the last major footholds of Latin Christian power in the East. For a time, the Crusader states steadied themselves, adapting to a life without Jerusalem, while clinging to the hope that one day the holy city might again open its gates to the cross. But hope alone could not shield them from the realities that shaped their lives. The Crusaders had always been few in number, an island of Latin Christians surrounded by a vast and diverse Muslim world. They survived through diplomacy, trade, alliances, and the strength of their fortresses. After Richard the Lionheart's departure, this balancing act became even more delicate. Some leaders tried to maintain peace through careful negotiation. Others, driven by ambition, launched reckless raids that endangered fragile truces. There were moments when the Crusader kingdoms flourished in peace, and moments when they trembled under the weight of their own divisions. The truth was simple and unavoidable. The Crusader states were never meant to last forever. They were bridges thrown across continents, fragile hopes anchored in foreign soil. But in their final century, they shone with a resilience that revealed the depth of human determination. Acre, now the capital, became a city unlike any other, mosaic of cultures woven together into a single humming tapestry. Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans competed fiercely in its harbors, their brightly painted ships crowding the water. Merchants from Syria and Egypt traded side by side with travelers from Provence and England. Knights in chainmail walked past scholars in flowing robes. The air was filled with a blend of languages: Arabic, French, Greek, Italian, each adding its rhythm to the city's heartbeat. Life in Acre felt vibrant, chaotic, and oddly hopeful. Children chased each other through narrow alleys. Bakers pulled warm loaves from stone ovens. Pilgrims knelt in busy chapels. And at night, lantern light glimmered on the city walls, casting long shadows over the harbor where masts swayed like dark silhouettes against the moonlit sea. If one walked along the coastline at dusk, the sound of waves would mingle with laughter, prayers, distant music, and the clatter of merchants unloading their goods. It was a world that felt alive, even as threats gathered quietly beyond the horizon. Meanwhile, deeper inland, the Crusader strongholds still stood firm. Crac des Chevaliers remained a masterpiece of stone and engineering, its walls glowing pale under the sun, its towers rising boldly against the sky. Beaufort Castle perched on its mountain ridge, watching the valleys stretch far into distant lands. Montfort, perched elegantly above a forest gorge, housed the Teutonic Order with discipline and quiet strength. These fortresses were not merely defensive structures. They were symbols of endurance, reminders that the Crusaders had once dreamed boldly enough to build kingdoms where none had existed before. Yet, even the strongest stones cannot stand forever against the relentless weight of history beyond the borders. The Muslim world continued to shift. After Saladin's death, new leaders emerged, some powerful, others less effective. But over the decades, one force grew steadily in strength, discipline, and ambition: the Mamluks of Egypt. Former enslaved soldiers turned rulers. They built an empire defined by strict order, hardened training, and remarkable military skill. Unlike earlier opponents who were divided and inconsistent, the Mamluks were united, efficient, and driven by a clear purpose. For the Crusader states, this rising power felt like the distant approach of thunder. There were still moments of peace. Treaties were signed, merchants prospered, and envoys traveled back and forth across borders. But the sense of vulnerability never disappeared. Every Crusader castle knew it existed within a temporary world. Every soldier knew reinforcements from Europe were no longer guaranteed. Every noble knew that without unity, the kingdom's days were numbered. The cracks began to widen in some Crusader cities. Italian merchant factions fought each other with almost as much intensity as they fought foreign enemies. Noble families quarreled over titles and land. Misunderstandings with local communities created unnecessary friction. The idealistic unity of the First Crusade, once powered by shared purpose, had splintered into competing interests. And then came the fall of cities, one by one. Tripoli, after years of tension, finally succumbed to Mamluk power. Its walls, though proud, could not withstand the disciplined siege engines arrayed against them. Streets once filled with laughter and trade fell silent. Survivors fled to Acre, the last great refuge of the Crusader world. Acre itself, vibrant and animated only years earlier, began to feel the weight of destiny pressing upon it. Rumors spread of Mamluk forces gathering in numbers that dwarfed anything the Crusaders could muster. Knights tightened their armor straps. Merchants hid their valuables. Families whispered prayers over sleeping children. And through it all, the sea remained calm, its waves gently brushing the shore as though unaware of the storm preparing to break. When the Mamluk army finally arrived, the horizon darkened with banners. Their siege towers rose like giants. Their war drums reverberated through the earth. Acre's defenders, brave but outnumbered, rushed to the walls as arrows filled the sky. The air carried the scent of smoke, sweat, salt, and fear. Inside the city, life continued for as long as it could. Mothers comforted children in dim rooms. Priests lit candles before trembling altars. Soldiers shared quiet words of courage before returning to the battlements. Some residents tried to flee by ship, their vessels pushing desperately into the crowded harbor. Others stayed, unwilling to abandon the city that had become their home. The siege grew relentless. Stones from catapults crashed into towers. Walls crumbled. The sound of battle echoed from dawn until dusk. And all the while, the Crusaders understood that they were fighting not just for Acre, but for the final breath of a kingdom that had lived on hope and determination for 200 years. When the walls finally fell, the end was swift. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land collapsed like a sandcastle meeting the tide. Ships carried survivors westward, their sails heavy, not with wind, but with sorrow. They looked back at the coastline fading into mist, knowing they might never see it again. Behind them, the Crusader Kingdoms vanished, not with a single collapse, but with a long exhale that released centuries of dreams into the sea air. And yet, even in their defeat, there was a strange sense of calm, because the Crusaders had learned something during their generations in the Levant. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, but the human spirit persists through all things. Their world had shaped them as much as they had shaped it. They had loved the land, struggled in it, adapted to it, and woven their stories into its soil. As their ships drifted westward, the sun sank low over the horizon, casting a soft, golden shimmer on the water. It felt less like an ending and more like history, folding into memory a gentle closing of a chapter that had always been, written with both hope and fragility. The last strongholds were gone, but the echoes of their world would not disappear. They would live on, carried gently by time. Long after the last Crusader ship slipped beyond the horizon, leaving behind the shores of Acre and the silent bones of fallen strongholds, the Holy Land remained bathed in the same warm sunlight that had once shone upon knights, pilgrims, monks, merchants, and families. The waves still whispered against the rocks. The wind still carried traces of distant spices through narrow streets, and the desert, vast and eternal, continued to stretch beneath the same unbroken sky. Yet something subtle lingered in the land, a presence woven into stone and soil, into memory and myth, into the stories that people still whispered beneath the stars. The Crusader Kingdoms had ended, but they had not vanished. History often imagines endings as abrupt, defined by final battles and last declarations. But endings, especially those that unfold across generations, fade gently rather than collapse. The Crusader world did not disappear the moment Acre fell. It lingered in the laughter of children born in the Levant to families who had once arrived from France or Germany. It lingered in the architecture, arched doorways, carved capitals, sturdy block walls that mixed European design with Levantine craftsmanship. It lingered in recipes passed down quietly from one household to another, marriages that blended cultures, and traditions that survived long after flags had changed. Travelers who ventured through the region in the decades after the fall often remarked on strange blends of language, French words tucked into Arabic conversation, Latin prayers echoing faintly in remote chapels where only a handful of monks remained. They found Crusader coins buried beneath olive trees, Crusader pottery in village markets, Crusader fortresses rising like sleeping giants above the hills. These remnants felt less like ruins and more like echoes reminders of an age when worlds had collided not only through conflict, but through curiosity, trade, and shared humanity for 2 centuries. The Crusader kingdoms had been a crossroads of cultures, and even in their absence, the land remembered. Imagine standing on the ramparts of crack-day Chevaliers, long after its garrisons had emptied. The sunlight warms the stone. The wind hums softly against the towers. Birds glide through the open sky. The castle, though silent, still holds the breath of countless stories nights when soldiers watched the horizon for distant fires. Mornings when cooks prepared meals in smoky kitchens. Afternoons when merchants arrived to trade silks and spices. The stone does not speak aloud, yet its presence feels alive with memories, and it is the same across the region. Walk through Occa's old streets, and you might feel the faint rhythm of footsteps from long ago. Wander near Jerusalem's ancient walls, and you may sense the weight of dreams carried by pilgrims who traveled endless miles. Explore the hills of Galilee or the valleys of Lebanon, and echoes of Crusader watchtowers may appear like shadows across the land. Even the quiet paths once walked by knights and farmers hold a kind of gentle remembrance, a whisper that says, "We were here, and we mattered." But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Crusader kingdoms lies not in their stones, but in the way they shaped imagination. For centuries after their fall, storytellers across Europe spoke of the Crusader lands as if they were scenes painted with golden light, filled with brave knights, noble queens, and shimmering cities beyond the sea. The reality had been far more complex, filled with diplomacy as much as war, coexistence as much as conflict, learning as much as loss. Yet the legends created by those who yearned for the Holy Land carved themselves into songs, poems, and tales told beside winter hearths. Children grew up hearing stories of distant battles and mysterious castles that rose above desert sands. Dreams of the East became part of Europe's cultural memory, shaping literature, art, and even architecture for generations. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the period of the Crusades became a symbol of endurance and unity. Leaders like Saladin were remembered not simply as warriors, but as figures of justice, discipline, and honor. The cities he reclaimed, Jerusalem, Damascus, Aleppo, continued to thrive, carrying forward traditions far older than the Crusader presence that briefly intertwined with them. The memory of the Crusades influenced art, literature, and politics across the Islamic world as well, becoming part of the region's collective reflection on identity and resilience. In this way, the Crusader kingdoms lived on not as victors or failures, but as chapters in a story shared by 2 great cultures whose histories became inseparable for a time. And as centuries passed, historians revisited those 200 years with fresh eyes. They peeled away the myths and discovered a world defined by far more than battle. They found records of treaties signed with respect, of medical knowledge shared across faiths, of agricultural innovations traded between continents, of families that blended traditions into new, vibrant forms. They found that the Crusader kingdoms were not only moments of conflict, but moments of connection, threads woven into a tapestry of human experience that stretched far beyond their own fragile years. Today, if you walk through the Holy Land at dawn, you might feel the gentle presence of those long-gone kingdoms in the stillness before the world fully wakes. The air is cool, the sky glows softly, and somewhere on the breeze there is a faint hum like a memory drifting just out of reach. Not sorrowful, not triumphant, simply present. Because history is not a collection of dates and battles. It is made of people, of their fears, their hopes, their mistakes, their dreams. The Crusaders who traveled across continents were not so different from us. They longed to belong. They searched for purpose. They tried to understand the world, even when it resisted understanding. And though their kingdoms fell, the stories they left behind continue to remind us that no chapter of human history ever truly disappears. It settles into the earth. It lingers in the air. It becomes part of the long, quiet song of time, as the final evening light falls over the hills of the Levant. The shadows stretch gently across ancient paths once trodden by knights and farmers alike. The stars begin to rise, just as they did centuries ago, and the land, eternal and patient, whispers back the stories it has carried for so long. The Crusader Kingdoms may have let go of their stones, their banners, their walls, but their echoes remain softly woven into the sand, reminders that even fragile dreams can leave footprints that last forever.